Poe and Finn didn't know if they could trust Ben, but recognizing that he was their only hope, Finn followed his instincts and the group concluded that Ben should return to the First Order and play the role of Supreme Leader once again. Back on Exegol, Rey had assumed the throne of the Sith and broadcasted her rule to the rest of the galaxy. After striking her grandfather down, she summoned a continuous wave of Force lightning far more powerful than what Palpatine could create on his own. Their combined strength was far more than the Resistance fleet could handle, and so they retreated. In a roundabout way, Palpatine had given his granddaughter exactly what was promised. She did indeed save her friends, at least for the time being. Upon Kylo Ren's return to the First Order, the Sith fleet would combine with the First Order to create the most devastating legion of terror the galaxy had ever seen. Empress Palpatine now reigned over the galaxy with absolute power alongside the Supreme Leader, confident that the Resistance posed no threat to she and Kylo Ren's rule. With every passing day, she grew stronger, deepening her connection to the dark side and connecting more and more with her grandfather. Many months pass and the Final Order's flags reign over the entire galaxy, decimating any systems who defy them, while taking thousands of children from their families to support their ever-growing army. Kylo and Rey operate individually most of the time, working different sectors of the galaxy to double their progress while on the same page as one another at all times thanks to their unique connection. And all the while, the Empress remains completely unaware of the army that is quietly growing before her very eyes. Kylo frequently takes his ship and heads out on his own to keep the Resistance in the loop. Finn and Poe grew frustrated with the Final Order's destruction of planet after planet, but Ben assured them that if it weren't for him, the damage would be much worse. He never stayed for long, but every time he came, he would spend a short time alone with Finn. The ex-stormtrooper was not overwhelmingly impressive in his connection to the Force, nor in his progression with his training, but Ben Solo knew he was going to need all of the help he could get, so he decided to take Finn as his Jedi apprentice, training him in the ways of the Force and eventually helping him to construct his own lightsaber. Over time, Finn comes to trust Ben, and the two begin to connect with one another, becoming very good friends, maybe the best friend Ben had ever had, which isn't saying much. Despite Finn's acceptance of Ben, Poe and Chewie still refuse to let their guard down, unwilling to trust him until he proves himself, which was a common mentality for most Resistance troopers. But Ben remains unbothered by the lack of trust. Kylo Ren is dead. He knows that, and in time, they will too. More time elapses, and the Final Order is now 3 years into their reign. Ben Solo knows that the time to put his plan into action has come. His plan is shaky at best. Everything will have to go perfectly according to plan for them to have any shot, but this may be their only chance. Rey has returned to Exegol and requested to meet with Kylo Ren, so they can discuss their next move. He and one other TIE fighter exit his destroyer and Ren goes to meet Rey. Kylo arrives in her throne room alone and joins her as she gazes out her window, looking over their army. "It's been a long time," Rey says. "There is a mutiny on the horizon. Rebels are hiding in plain sight within our ranks. They're everywhere." Ben turned his head toward her and almost couldn't hide his devastation, not with what he was hearing, but with what he saw. He had not realized until now just how long it had been since they'd seen each other. As Rey continued to gaze ahead, Ben looked upon a different woman than the one he'd nearly fallen in love with years ago. Her face was about the same as he'd remembered, but her expression was gloomy, her eyes were dark, stripped of the unbreakable hope she'd once carried. He whispered her name and Rey turned slowly. His heart dropped and he instantly forgot what he was going to say. Her body said Rey, but her eyes screamed Darth Sidious. This wasn't Rey at all. The woman he knew was gone. He quickly turned and strolled toward the middle of the room, rallying his thoughts. A familiar phrase echoed in his head. "No one's ever really gone." He stopped with his back still turned and spoke. "Rey, it's time for you to come back. The Final Order ends today." The entrance door to the throne room opened and Finn entered. Ben met his apprentice's eyes, nodded, and then turned to face her. Rey looked at Finn as a smile came across her face and ignited her double-bladed red lightsaber. A series of explosions broke the silence outside as battle quickly broke out. Stormtroopers shot other stormtroopers as Resistance fighters suddenly sprang up all around. Ships began to pour in as the First Order and Resistance came together to face the Sith fleet. Rey lunged at Ben in a whirl of speed and rage. He and Finn deflected the onslaught, but Ben quickly found that this was a power like nothing he had ever faced before. His powers had doubled since he fought Rey on the Death Star, but this was simply not Rey. There were still traces of her fighting style here and there, but everything was faster and more calculated. Each strike had the power of Darth Sidious behind it, and that took a toll on his defenses. Without taking her focus away from Ben at all, she discarded Finn with a blast of force lightning that sent him smashing into the wall, and instantly dropping to the floor. She pressed harder toward Ben, but as Finn's lifeless body hit the ground, something happened. A small lapse in her focus. Ben saw a flicker in her eyes, as the yellow flare was pushed away for the briefest moment before returning as she screamed and attacked with more anger and passion than before. He now knew what he had to do. That small glimmer of hope was all he needed to see. Ben continued to defend himself with everything he had, as Rey swung again and again at his impenetrable blockade. Even Darth Sidious had never seen this sort of skill before. Ben Solo was not going to lose. He was determined to save Rey at all costs. He spoke to her as they fought, reminding her of Luke and Leia, of Finn and Poe and Rose, of her parents, desperately searching for anything that could awaken that flash of light. He then struck her with all of his might as Rey fell to her knees. Ben circled with caution, unwilling to kill her, desperate for her to join him, just as he had been all those times they fought before. Rey, join me. Palpatine is the real enemy. We'll kill him. Together. Rey was awakened now. She jumped at him again, but two personalities were flickering back and forth. Rey continued to attack and then pull back, as an internal struggle for power ensued. But just before Sidious took over once again, Rey managed to speak. Ben, strike me down. It's the only way. He hesitated for a moment, unsure if he could bring himself to do what she was asking of him. But a voice came to him through the Force. Finish what I started, Ben. His thoughts became clear. He attacked his enemy with a singular goal: destroy the Sith. But as he swung his blade at Rey, Ben was struck with force lightning and flew backward. As Rey leapt toward him, Ben rolled to the side, but she managed to catch him before he could complete the maneuver, as her lightsaber plunged through Ben's shoulder. She removed the weapon and prepared to strike again, but she was sent backward by a force even Darth Sidious had never felt before. The Empress raised her head to see a man she knew all too well. Anakin stood beside his grandson with his arm outstretched. He looked to Ben and before disappearing said, "This time we'll do it together." Ben now rose to his feet, the strength of his grandfather now pulsing through his body. He ran at his enemy with a clear hole running straight through his shoulder, and the ultimate battle between Skywalker and Palpatine continued. Ben was more focused than ever. Every move he made was more precise, more calculated. And there it was. The slightest opening, a hole in Palpatine's armor. He struck the Sith Lord down, pushing his lightsaber through Rey's torso as she fell to her knees, clutching her stomach. Tears in her eyes as she desperately looked up to her other half, and then collapsed. Palpatine's spirit left her body, and Ben suddenly felt weaker than ever. He held Rey in his arms, overcome by the sensations of fear and extreme vulnerability, as Rey's final breath left her body. Finn had woken up now. Barely able to open his eyes, he could hardly make out the silhouettes of the two figures on the ground across the throne room. He watched as Ben gathered his emotions and remembered the sacrifice Rey had made for him on the Death Star. His life was waning now, as he placed his hands on Rey's womb and began to transfer everything he had left into her. He was going to die, but that was okay. Rey deserved a chance at a happy life. As Ben's last reservoirs were drained, Rey awakened. The two kissed, and then the last living Skywalker fell back, at peace with what he had done here today, happy to have given Rey back to the galaxy. Seeing his grandson's sacrifice, Anakin appeared before Rey one last time. He knelt next to his grandson, placing his hand on his chest, as Ben abruptly sat back up. Anakin smiled. "You have done what I set out to do, Ben. You finished what I started, and now my legacy is complete. But your story doesn't end here. Go finish your journey, create your own destiny. You're free, Ben." He looked at Rey. "You're both finally free." Anakin disappeared, and Rey and Ben emerged from the building a short while later, as Ben carried Finn in his arms. The battle was over. The last Skywalker had finally risen and done what he set out to do. Now, only now, had he proven himself to the galaxy. He handed Finn over for medical attention as Chewbacca ran toward them. He hugged Rey and Ben tightly, unable to contain his excitement. Barely able to see over Chewie's shoulder, Ben opened his eyes and saw a man standing outside the Falcon with a hopeful grin on his face. Ben walked over to him and they stared at each other for a moment. Both of them finally smiled and laughed as Lando hugged Ben. The two boarded the Falcon along with Rey and Chewie and took off, heading back to the Resistance base before Ben and Rey left once again, to pay homage to their predecessors before the twin sons of Tatooine. The dyad finally felt right. Balance had been restored, and they watched the suns rise, happy with how far they had come, but equally excited to write the next chapter of their story, together at last.